Hi, I'm Emily Torty from Appalachian Sustainable Development. Thanks for joining us as we take a look at alley cropping for the small-scale diversified farm. Here's where we're headed. I'll start by talking just a little bit about agroforestry in general and where alley cropping fits in as an agroforestry practice. Then we'll take a look at a few farms that are working with alley cropping. First, we head to Peacemeal Farm, where Betsy Trice has designed an alley cropping project for diversification of workload in the calendar year and products on their site. Second, we'll look at Appalachian Sustainable Development's alley cropping site, which is just over a year old and focused on woody cut florals production. Lastly, I speak with Kaitie Adams of the Savanah Institute, who's worked in alley cropping for a number of years on farms ranging from 2 acres to over 100. Along the way, we'll discuss some of the most important design and management questions for farms who are considering this practice. Let's take a look. So, what is agroforestry? First of all, agroforestry has deep roots in indigenous farming practices all over the world. This work is not new, but is experiencing a resurgence in the world of sustainable farming, as these techniques can be highly effective, low impact, regenerative, and culturally valuable. Today, in the U.S., we know agroforestry by the USDA's definition, which states that agroforestry is the intentional integration of trees and shrubs into crop and animal farming systems to create environmental, economic, and social benefits. It's a bit of a mashup word with agro referring to crops and agriculture, and forestry referring to tree crops and perennial systems. There are 5 federally recognized agroforestry practices: riparian buffers, windbreaks, alley cropping, forest farming, and silvopasture. Although all of these are capable of production, riparian buffers and windbreaks typically emphasize conservation in their goals and outcomes, whereas alley cropping, forest farming, and silvopasture are traditionally more focused on production and outputs. In this video, we're focused on alley cropping, which the USDA describes as plantings consisting of trees or shrubs in rows or corridors with alleys of agronomic crops or forage between. These productive alleyways can host all kinds of crops, everything from hay production to annual vegetables. The trees and shrubs are sometimes focused on additional production like chestnuts, hazelnuts, or fruit trees. Other times, they might be focused solely on crop benefit, like buffering wind and harsh sun or fixing nitrogen. Both the alleyways and tree or shrub rows can be focused solely on biodiversity as well. So there are lots of options in alley cropping, which can make it seem intimidating, but the good news is you can customize it to just about any site. Alley cropping can have lots of benefits, like increasing or diversifying your production by allowing you to grow wood or tree products in addition to what's already growing in the field. It can enhance the microclimate conditions in the field to benefit crops or forage quality by buffering stressful winds or creating slightly shadier, cooler environments, for example. Alley cropping can also help reduce erosion. The living roots in the soil can help contribute to positive soil structure and also just physically hold the soil in place, which helps reduce both wind and water erosion. Now that you know a little more about it, let's take a look at the practice. First, let's take a look at Peacemeal Farm, run by Chris and Betsy Trice. They're a diversified small farm who sells pasture-raised meats at the farmer's market and grows seed crops on contract, among other things. They're also regularly hosting local educational groups from the Shenandoah Permaculture Institute and J. Sargent Reynolds Community College, where Betsy teaches. They're in the design and establishment phase of their alley cropping project.
I am Betsy Trice. We're here at my husband and I's farm, Peacemeal Farm in Haydensville, Virginia. We do a little bit of everything. We're a diversified small farm. We raise pastured meats and eggs, vegetable seed crops, and a lot of foods for ourselves. We are interested in doing alley cropping to incorporate more perennials into our currently annual vegetable space, for just diversifying the types of plants that are in the ground for the health of the soil, but also just diversifying products and income off of the farm, and switching up the labor needs, the time of the year when the labor is needed. Yeah, so with our annual vegetables in particular, like there's a heavy workload coming in May, getting everything established, and then again at the end of the season, like harvesting and cleaning all of those seeds. So trying to bring in plants that require labor at different times of the year is really helpful to sort of to balance that out. So this current space and garden now is just annual vegetables grown for seed production for seed companies. And we're going to be integrating perennial shrubs in throughout it to create enough space in alleys to continue growing our annual vegetables, to get a different product and to have more perennial plants in that space. We will be incorporating elderberry and gumi and some seed berries. And so those were chosen because we wanted perennial shrubs. We didn't really want anything that got more than 15 feet tall to shade out the vegetables in the alleys too much. The main one is the elderberries, and then the gumi and sea berries were added as nitrogen fixers to add some nitrogen into the system as well. This alley cropping project is funded by an American Farmland Trust Grant, the Regenerate Virginia Healthy Soils Grant. Okay, I hadn't really thought through like if it makes sense financially. I feel like it does. I feel like it's going to. I did actually rough out like back of the envelope potential yields and like the market price. And that would definitely be worth it in the long run. That's going to add just another layer of income from this space. But some of the big considerations were the orientation of our beds. So since we're incorporating perennial shrubs, we're completely shifting our layout to run north to south. So as the sun moves across the sky, our annual vegetables get the sunlight will touch all of them. Whereas we had it oriented east to west before for the water.
All right, so we're here in front of the alley cropping site at Peacemeal, and I'm gonna have Betsy walk us through just like what the layout's gonna look like a little bit since they're still in establishment phase.
Yeah, so last fall, after the seed crops were done producing, I sowed a really thick seeding of cereal rye and crimson clover. There was also some winter peas, and it ended up being a really good stand. So this was just cut down last night with a hay mower so we could keep the stalks like their full length. So I plan to use some of this as a mulch for the vegetable crops this year.
It is such a nice thick
yeah,
crop that
it was
got.
and it was easily 6 feet tall.
Awesome.
At the height.
So, all right, take us through the layout a little bit.
So the rows are gonna run north to south. So they're gonna run this way. And then the elderberry gumi rows will be basically 34 feet apart. So leaving space in the middle for annual vegetables still.
So you've left a lot of flexibility in so that your plans can shift gracefully over the long term, right? Could you talk a little bit about, I know you told me that you kind of planned your spacing to work with annuals or perennials or different types of annuals. Maybe unpack that a little bit.
So we spaced the rows with enough room that we could put multiple rows of up to 4 rows of small annual vegetables, a smaller number of rows if they're sprawling like winter squash, which we normally grow. So in these rows, we would just be able to like fit 1 or 2. But thinking in the long term, if we decided to move back from annual vegetables, like especially as we get older, there's enough room that we could incorporate just more perennials in there as well, whether they be like more elderberries or a totally different crop.
Awesome. So I know you've talked about wanting to diversify income streams and diversify products with this project. Do you have any thoughts about kind of like the long-term goals with that? Are you thinking value added? Are you thinking, direct to consumer, or just general like market stand diversification?
We're still figuring a lot of that out, or like tossing a lot of ideas around. But over the years, because we do have a few other elderberries on the property, I've gotten really comfortable in using elderberry. So in the long term, value added products would be nice to include. There would be some infrastructure we would need for that, like a certified kitchen. So we would probably start off by offering a U-pick and seeing if they're like the herbal medicine community, see how they respond to that, and then moving towards selling frozen berries, and maybe once we have the other infrastructure, selling the value-added products. The gumi is a little bit different in that I'm not as familiar in using and marketing that fruit. There's less of those plants that'll be in here. Elderberry is the main focus. So we're just going to have to, I don't know, that'll be a learning curve and seeing where that goes.
And were you able to have some fun in the design process and just kind of different iterations?
Yeah, figuring out, we kind of went back and forth on different spaces, like what that would look like, having enough room for the vegetable crops and seeing how many rows fit through here. Another thing we're thinking about with the diversified income is there's going to be 8 rows and we've got 8 different cultivars of elderberry. Cool. So we're thinking just elderberry propagation and selling plants too would be part of that diversification.
We wrapped up our chat by asking Betsy about what her biggest goals are for the project.
I think just diversification and diversification of a lot of different things. But I think specifically bringing in perennials, something that doesn't need to be established every year. So if something were to happen, those plants will still be there and I can get a harvest off of it. And I didn't need to put them in the ground that spring.
Well, thanks for having us out at the farm, Betsy. We really appreciate it. And
I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how this project comes along.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Next, we go to Appalachian Sustainable Development's Singing Wood Ag Campus, where they're managing a newly established alley cropping site that just turned 1 year old. I'm here standing at the top of the ASD Alley Cropping site, and this was put in the ground just almost exactly a year ago, so it's really exciting to see how far it's come in that amount of time. You can see I'm standing in front of some really thriving forsythia, really nice and tall and healthy. There are 5 shrub rows, which I'll show you all in a minute, and 4 accompanying alleyways, along with a big swath of willow coppice at the bottom. This whole site has been designed with the idea of woody cut flower production. So we've got forsythia at the top and 4 more rows of shrubs going down towards the bottom. First we have hydrangea, and then nandina, which is heavenly bamboo. We've got a holly row and a red and yellow twig dogwood row at the bottom. These are all things that can be propagated easily and also marketed for cut flowers in the dormant season. The alleyways in between, we allowed spacing for a mown grass pathway and then an alley crop. This row has not been tilled yet. And then another mown grass pathway. That way, as these shrubs fill out and take up more of the alleyway, there's still plenty of mowing room in between what is the shrub and the alley crop. You can see the planting layout pretty well in this spot. So we've got the actual alley crop here, and dahlias were installed here on drip tape last year. And then you can see there's a really clear area for mowing here and here, so that as the shrubs get bigger and take up more of the alleyway, there will still be plenty of room to be able to access these plants for harvest and these plants for harvest. So we've got nandina, dahlias, and then hydrangea, which experienced a good bit of deer pressure, so they're not looking as happy right now. But luckily, these are all woody perennials that we can propagate here on site and refill the spots where they've died out. This alleyway has yet to be tilled, so it's perfectly fine to install your shrub crops or your tree crops and worry about your alleyways later. This is a good way for us to transition this space. We're just working in 1 new alleyway per year as we have labor and time and energy and funding to do so. So in the meantime, what we're doing in the summer seasons is just coming in and giving these a cover crop. So pretty soon these are going to get tilled and reseeded. They were cover cropped once last year, but they're going to get a couple good rounds of cover crop this year. And we'll just be building soil towards the long-term goal of having crops in all of these alleyways. Taking a look at the nuts and bolts of this space, we're looking at the irrigation system. There's a splitter at the top of the site with labeled header lines running to each of the 3 different production types. Drip tape for the herbs in the alleyways, spaghetti tubing for precision watering of the shrubs, and overhead sprinklers for the willow block. We found that in systems like this that require semi-complex management, the best thing you can do is label things really well. So this is really specific. Run this one solo. This is the willow line, and we need enough pressure to run the sprinklers. This is herbs and drip tape, and this is shrubs. So we've got a shut off for each of these, and so we can run one line at a time. This spaghetti tubing type of irrigation has been really great because we can arrange these to deliver the water right at the base of the plants. There's just a little landscaping staple that it tucks in underneath right there. But that is the other management piece that has been a little bit of a thing, is having someone check these spaghetti tubes all the time. Because we're adding all this complexity with all these points that we've punched into the tubes and, all these connections. So for every plant, we have 2 different connections now. We have the connection into the feeder tube, and then we have the connection at the actual emitter. So, for all the plants, we've got duplicate connections, and that means that there's that many times that something can pop off. So there's a lot of opportunity for there to be little leaks in the system. It's very manageable, but it's the kind of thing that needs to be built into our maintenance plan here, is that there is at least a weekly walk around irrigation check when the water is running, particularly on the spaghetti tubes. The main issues we've had with the alley cropping site really relate to deer pressure. We don't have any sort of perimeter fencing, and we have this nice forested border around this space, which is really great, except for the fact that it's definitely a deer corridor in this area, so we get a lot of nibbling. At some point, we may set up a 3D deer fence or figure out some other type of perimeter fencing, but it's just not in the cards at the moment. So we have sprayed some deer deterrent. We have employees that are out here. The more often people are out here, the less deer pressure we see. We have one employee who's allowed to bring their dogs to hang out. That also really helps out. But you'll see these are all kind of nibbled off. It looks sort of like a well-pinched basil plant, which isn't really what we want for production. But until we come up with some sort of more serious deer pressure relief, that's probably just going to be a reality of it. Because we set everything up in landscaping fabric and with irrigation, we're not having a lot of issues with weed pressure. We're not having a lot of issues during drought. We had a big drought last year and everything survived pretty well from the drought. The issues that we had really mostly were things getting nibbled on. We really wanted to set this site up in general so that it was very low maintenance, because we do sort of have a rotating crew of people that are managing over here. So we wanted to make sure that it was really easy for people to kind of come and go from this space, and so that it would more or less take care of itself. So the more planning and upfront maintenance you do, the easier it's going to be to do the long-term maintenance. So it was kind of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure type of thing. And lastly, I'm down here in the willow block at the bottom of the planting. This isn't technically one of our shrub or alley crops. This is kind of a below the planting area, but I want to show these because I do know a lot of folks are putting willow into their alley cropping systems because of their ability to be coppiced and managed at virtually any size. So these are going to get coppiced or harvested low, like the whole biomass of the plant harvested low annually. And so they won't ever get huge and unmanageable the way you can think of like a full-size willow tree being. So these also are a part of the scheme for woody cut florals. This is a curly willow here. This is a basket tree willow here. So these are cut and harvested in the dormant season, a time when farms usually have less income opportunities. So it's a nice thing to add on during those cold winter months. To finish off, we chat with Kaitie Adams of the Savanah Institute and learn from her wealth of experience in alley cropping at many scales and under many different types of management, from conventional to all natural. Right. I'm here with Kaitie Adams from the Savanah Institute. Morning, Kaitie. And
Morning.
yeah, and we're excited to have a little chat about alley cropping. She's got a lot of experience everywhere from managing 2 acres to 120 acres. So I'm going to let her introduce herself a little bit and talk about what she's got going on, and then we'll fire some questions.
Thanks so much for the invitation to talk about alley cropping, which is something I could talk about all day long because it's one of the systems I love to work the most in. And through my role with Savanah Institute, I work both on our Savanah Institute managed demonstration farms, managing alley cropping, but I've also done that for other farms that I work with and help design alley cropping systems as well that are on both small scale or highly diversified food production farms, such as vegetable farms or cut flower farms, all the way up to working with large scale commodity growers and corn and soybean systems. And so alley cropping has lots of different benefits to add and can achieve lots of different goals depending on what folks are needing to do with trees on their farms.
What do you think are some of the sort of low-hanging fruit alley cropping opportunities out there for producers, sort of like conceptually?
Yeah, alley cropping can seem really intimidating because we're planting trees into the middle of fields, where main production is happening, whether it be fruits or vegetables or things like grains. But it can be pretty simple if you choose trees that work really well with what you're growing on the other side of them. And so some of the easiest ways to start with alley cropping is to think of like conservation goals and to use trees that are native or are able to provide some sort of more conservation benefit compared to a production benefit. So think of like hedgerows. Hedgerows used to be used on farms all the time to protect from wind, to divvy up fields, to provide sort of a break between crops, especially if you're trying to keep crops from cross-pollinating and to provide wildlife habitat. But we don't really have hedgerows on farms anymore. But if you think about planting, say, like a row of shrub willow or a row of like a native shrub, depending on where you are, kind of in the middle of production field, that can increase pollination for crops. It can provide a nice field break. If winds of pressure, it can provide that sort of protection for that. And it's just really beautiful to have on a farm landscape and sometimes allows folks to break fields into chunks for easier planning and rotation. And so, for example, one farm that I work with here in Illinois is using trees to break up a larger, like 19 acres, that's a vegetable farm, into these half-acre chunks that they can use to start putting into long-term rotation. And so that's kind of a low-hanging fruit. And then you can slowly add complexity over time. Some folks just want the conservation, and so native trees and shrubs are great for that. Um, some folks, though, want to add another layer of production. And so that's when we start thinking about fruits and nuts and what's compatible with things to the other side so that you are stacking enterprises on the same space.
Maybe walk us through some of these examples that you've got prepared.
So this is a photo of an alley cropping farm that I manage here in Champaign County, Illinois. It's 120 acres. And we have multiple alley cropping production systems happening on this farm. And one of them is corn and soybean rotation with native trees running through the middle. So the alley crop is the grain, and then the tree rows are kind of the agroforestry element of the farm. These are black locust trees. We planted them in 3-row blocks. Trees grow better when they have companions, and especially if we're putting them in a sea of corn and soybeans. We need to have a community of trees. And these are particularly there for one, to provide roots in the soil. So that's the number one. Two, uh, black locust are nitrogen fixing trees. They're one of the few leguminous trees that we have in Midwestern temperate systems. So we're interested in seeing how adding a legume, perennial legume into the system maximizes the benefits for both the crops beside it as well as the trees themselves. And the third is that we're doing some carbon sequestration work and carbon sequestration monitoring. it's a good example of how we can add native trees back into production systems in ways where the production system that's adjacent to it doesn't have to really change much of anything. And so this is where we're experimenting with, can large scale production farms really continue to farm in the ways that they need to hit their bottom line and keep their businesses afloat, but we're just adding trees into it. And so we work in multi-party systems where we have folks that take care of the trees, and that's their main focus, that's their expertise. And then we partner with farmers that are doing the production crops in the rows, so that there's two experts in the field that can focus on what they need to do, instead of having a row crop farmer learn how to farm trees or having tree farmers learn how to do crop production.
And so this is managed conventionally, correct?
This is managed conventionally. And so this has been a farm that's been in corn and soybean production for uh, decades and decades and decades. And so right now we have even conventional management of our tree crops, which we're going to step down over time. But it's part of a transition plan. Corn and soybeans aren't going to be able to be grown on these, grain and timber alley cropping sites forever, because the trees will eventually get so big that they'll start shading out the crops. So then we're thinking about transition, like in this system, to winter wheat, where wheat is doing most of its growing during the winter, where there's no light on the trees, and then have the option to go into silvopastoral systems. So we're really thinking multiple successions ahead of what's the production going to change, what row crop production will change in the alleys, and then when can we bring animals into the system, because that's kind of the ultimate goal, and where we have the most kind of um, ecosystem benefits, especially with carbon sequestration, when we're able to get animals back on the land.
I think that leads nicely into my next question, which is sort of about complexity and how we're increasing complexity in this work in a good way, but it necessarily increases complexity in the management, in the design, and all the other, like there's a ripple effect in that. So like what are sort of the challenges, pitfalls, or errors that you see might help a newer alley cropping practitioner? What does your experience tell you about that?
Great question. As agroforesters, we highly value diversity. That's kind of why we got into this, is to diversify and create resilient systems. And sometimes we get so focused on diversity that we sometimes neglect practicality within that. And so with alley cropping, you have to manage two systems in one that have intentionally been brought together. I think my biggest piece of advice that I need to also take myself is to try to find ways to simplify an already complex system. So, for example, adding, we almost want, we have this avoidance of monoculture. And so monoculture in our work can sometimes be a dirty word. We don't want monocultures. Like, that's the opposite of what we're doing. But if we think about a tree row, and if we're adding a row of trees into another production system, can we just add one row of the same species and have a block that's maybe the same cultivar? So at least we have some discrete units that we can apply uniform management practices to, that might have uniform ripening windows or maintenance windows to help us plan out what work needs to get done over time for both caring for the trees, harvesting whatever's coming off of them, because we already have the complexity of at least two systems, and usually more than two species in the field. And also on the opposite side of that, leaning into complexity where it's easiest. And so the picture that's up on the screen that has our prairie planting here, this is a alley cropping system that has conservation in the alley. And so instead of producing something for humans. And so this was us playing around with, can we block off an area of an intense complexity and dial in the management for that sort of system and throw it right in the middle, so that we have a discrete complexity where we can kind of control the chaos to a certain extent, even though it's right next to a production zone, which are these hazelnuts. I think that's one way that we can start to think through the management of complexity in ways that are productive instead of destructive.
I feel like this is a very like workable example of including space for there to be sort of controlled chaos.
Yeah, the controlled chaos thing is something that I have found really helpful because agriculture is production. It's a spectrum, and so you can go all the way to conservation and get very little production, or go all the way to full production and get very little conservation. And finding that like healthy middle is really challenging. And so the picture on the left here is heart nuts that have elderberry growing between them. Um, all the elderberry are in blocks of cultivars. And so we have these, very large production blocks of one cultivar, but the cultivars change between blocks. And same things with the heart nuts. So we're able to have, I think we have 8 varieties of elderberry out there and 12 cultivars of heart nuts. So high level of diversity, but in a very discrete units.
So speaking to the complexity piece, once we create these systems, I feel like it's your whole job as a farmer is just managing edges. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the most challenging things is in alley cropping when you have these two production systems that are colliding with each other, especially if they have different management strategies. And so in like vegetable or specialty crop production, oftentimes perennials have a different management schedule or different needs than whatever annual or even perennial that you're growing in between your trees or shrubs. And those management practices and timing are sometimes at heads with each other. And so you might be cultivating an area next to a row of trees or shrubs that are there permanently. And what we've seen is even in systems where one person is managing both, these areas around the trees tend to enlarge or shrink over time. So for example, if we have like a tree planted in a row and then we went 3 feet on either or 5 feet on either side of that tree, that's kind of like this is the tree zone, what we sometimes call like the tree block that has either ground cover or you're managing weeds in that area. It almost never stays 3 feet or 5 feet because sometimes you're on the tractor or you're walking behind a BCS or doing some other sort of thing. And, you just kind of veer towards the tree or you veer away from it. And so then you have these like unmanaged spaces, and that's where weeds love to grow. They're like, great, no one's paying attention to me. There's bare soil. I'm just gonna explode. And those can become really challenging to manage. One, if you don't give yourself enough space around the trees to get in there with a weed whacker or a push mower or, a riding mower or a tractor mounted mower, and then the weeds just get out of control. No one wants to do a ton of weed whacking or hand pulling with trees. It's just a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
So if you can avoid that, that can, and you give yourself enough space around trees to get in to have maintenance zones and know that there's going to be some of this weird sort of maintenance overlap, you can play with that in your design. And so like my biggest piece of advice is to give yourself enough space around the trees and shrubs and enough buffer zone between the tree area and whatever you're alley cropping to be able to make good management decisions with effective timing where you're able to get in and manage that.
Great. So I would love to hear more about your small scale alley cropping experience.
Well, I learned how to alley crop at a farm before I started working at Savanah Institute, but I didn't know it was called alley cropping. And so I didn't know what agroforestry was. I didn't know what alley cropping was when I was growing vegetables on a community farm in between rows of trees. EarthDance Organic Farm School is in Ferguson, Missouri, and I had the pleasure of working with them for multiple seasons. And they were doing some really interesting alley cropping in between rows of fruit and nut trees that also had perennial pollinator plants perennial herbs and medicinals. And the farm was on a slope. And so they did it on a berm and swale system. And so the way they set it up was they had berms of trees that were every 100 feet, and in between those, there are permanent vegetable beds. So this is a no-till system. And so what we saw was that one, the trees were, along with the berms, were doing really amazing work of stopping water as it was flowing down the hill. They were moving into the swales, they were watering the trees, and it kept it from washing out the vegetable beds, which was really vital. It wasn't a perfect system, but it worked really well to have those permanent root systems there. Two, adding the trees provided some really important shade, especially for greens crops. During like the Missouri summers, it would get really hard to grow lettuce or tender greens, and folks really want to eat salad during the summer. And so just having a tiny bit of shade for part of the day really help with that and help with the taste and take away some of the bitterness from heat stress. Having even just like a little bit of afternoon shade was just really, really helpful for those greens. And it was just really beautiful to have out there as well. These trees have gotten much bigger. And so now the trees are starting to shade the vegetable plots a little bit. And so you're losing some production space. And so like the 100 feet of growing space is shrinking a little bit. But they're opening up new growing spaces in different parts of the farm. And so there's been kind of these shifts in production that's happening in different places. And the management has been a little bit challenging because as the trees have grown and there's a high diversity of things like apples and pears and plums and pawpaws and all of those things, they've needed to bring on some specialized support of some folks that are more focused on the fruit production because it does go into their marketing channels, and so they want good high quality fruit so they can sell. And so they've had to bring in some more expertise where before those of us that remain in the vegetables were also managing the trees. And now that the trees are more mature and producing, there's more support needed for pest management and pruning and harvest and those sort of things. But a really beautiful example on a farm, it was 14 total acres. But this was spread over about 10 acres, and there was about 2 acres of outdoor vegetable production interspersed with trees. And so this is a alley cropping system that we're seeing more and more, specifically on vegetable farms or even cut floral farms, is adding trees into systems. And so my husband's farm in Sola Gratia here in Urbana, Illinois, is the one I was talking about earlier that had half-acre blocks of production that they were setting up. And so they have a CSA, they sell at farmers markets. They do a lot of production for food access programs. People want fruit and they have these kind of a demand for them. And so they're adding trees right into their production fields as a way to get those sort of market demand things, break up the farm into smaller blocks, and then get the benefits that I was talking about that we saw at EarthDance. And so they're doing, common sort of things, apples, raspberries, blackberries, and then some unusual things like hazelnuts to add into that. And so they know that over time it'll get a little bit more complex, but they're excited to have that be part of their production system. And also they recently moved onto a much larger farm that they had been growing on. And so they needed sort of the perennials to get up and get going, to start, utilizing space that they didn't necessarily have all the capacity to. And so some of this farm right now is just in cover crop and is being planted to trees, and then they'll slowly start rotating the production. And so this is a great example of sometimes folks have more land than they know what to do with, and setting up future alley cropping can be one way to help utilize the space. So as your trees are getting established, doing a lot of soil building so that you can slowly expand your production over time instead of trying to tackle a giant project at once. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about with alley cropping and the potential for that is the ways that you can set up long-term successional models And so alley cropping, trees and cover crop, or trees and setting up pasture for haying as a land management strategy that can allow you to slowly change the farm over time, add different options so that you're not tied into one system forever. Like right now we're doing this, but I know because of the way that we've designed this, we have the option to move into annual production in the alleys, to bring animals into that area, to hay that area, to do small grains, to add more trees and create an orchard. It's sort of this opportunity to not have to make every decision all at once, but give yourself the gift of options and adaptability because there's so many changes with funding and weather and management that we, within perennial systems, if we can give ourselves as many options as possible, that's like the best gift.
Well, thank you so much, Kaitie. This has been really useful, and I love seeing all the examples, and I just love being able to lean into your experience. So thanks for being available for this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Emily. I appreciate the invitation. Alley cropping's the future.
Thanks for joining us to explore alley cropping as a practical method of diversification for small farms. We hope you'll consider the practice a part of your sustainable farming toolkit.